Hey, welcome. We're so glad everybody's here listening to Incorruptible Mass. This is where we help you understand state politics. We talk a lot about why it is so broken, what we can have here in Massachusetts if we fixed it, and how you can get involved. So we have a super amazing, incredible guest today, Mallory Hanora from Families for Justice as Healing. And we're going to be talking about the prison moratorium. We're going to be talking about pretrial detention, no-cost calls, a lot of issues that affect incarcerated people in Massachusetts and what bills have been happening lately, what has been happening lately around those bills. But before we get into that, I will quickly introduce my two super fabulous co-hosts. And I will start with Jordan Berg Powers.
Jordan Berg Powers, I use he, him, and I have several years experience in progressive politics.
Jonathan Cohn.
Jonathan Cohn, he, him. I'm an organizer from Boston. I've been active in electoral and progressive electoral and issue politics here in Massachusetts as well. Happy to be here and happy to have our guest with us today.
Anna Callahan, she her coming at you from Medford, and excited to have Mallory here to talk about these bills. There's been a lot of activity, a lot of organizing, a lot of action happening at the State House. So Mallory, if you would first just introduce yourself and introduce Families for Justice as Healing, and let us know kind of what your mission is and as well as what you're working on right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So good to be with you all. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Mallory Hanora. I'm the director of Families for Justice as Healing, and our mission is to end the incarceration of women and girls, period. That's a complete sentence. We believe it's possible. We know we can do it here in Massachusetts, and we never stop working towards that goal. Our organization was founded by my boss and mentor, Andrea James, and the sisters that she was incarcerated with, who continue to lead our movement today, Sister Virginia, Taz, Shay, and others who make up the leadership circle of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. So Families for Justice as Healing is a proud member of the National Council. And these sisters started organizing inside the women's prison inside 2010 when they were hearing a national conversation about criminal justice reform that didn't include women at all, as if women were not incarcerated in this country. And so they made a commitment to fight to free each other and to bring the most directly affected voices to the policy table. So Andrea brought that work back here to Roxbury, Massachusetts, where our family has been for 5 generations. And our office is based in Roxbury. And we are organizing here in Massachusetts 12 years later, still towards that goal. And sisters came home around the country, and those are the members and leaders of the National Council. So that's who we are.
Amazing and super important work. And I would love to hear about what's been happening. Like there's so much been going on with the prison moratorium. So if you can break that down for people who maybe don't know exactly what that's about, and then talk about no-cost calls as well, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. So if we could zoom out for just 1 second, the origin of the jail and prison construction moratorium started because we've been fighting against the state's proposed plan to build a new women's prison here in Massachusetts. And we've been leading that fight since the end of 2019. So the 200 women were moved from Framingham, MCI Framingham, the only state prison for women, to South Bay, aka the Suffolk County House of Corrections. And we said, what's happening? It was a move that threw women's lives into crisis and chaos. Their families were not alerted. Nobody in the community was told. And we started raising red flags like, why is this happening? And why aren't we talking about what else is possible except for moving, dozens and dozens of women from the state prison to this county jail where they're locked down for much longer. And it's a terrible environment for all people and especially for women. Sarah Tompkins said on the record, this is part of a longer term plan to close MCI Framingham, and DOC said nothing to see here. That's not what's happening. And not but 2 months later, the state released its first request for proposals for an architecture firm to study and design a new women's prison. And since then, we've been doing everything we can to stop the new women's prison project, to release women from Framingham so that we can just empty out Framingham and close it forever without replacing it. So we've tried legal challenges, administrative challenges, and finally we're like, what if the people created legislation that would create a pause button so that we can't do jail and prison construction for 5 years in Massachusetts, so we can really pause and focus on what else is possible, right? What else is possible for women in our families, besides just doubling and tripling down on this increasing investment in incarceration. And so that legislation was filed in January of 2021, and we spent the past 18 months organizing across the state to pass the jail and prison construction moratorium. We're super thankful to Senator Joe Comerford and Representative China Tyler, who were our lead sponsors. And that bill, a version of it, ended up in the House Infrastructure Bond Bill. And we were like, okay, let's go, like, let's do this, we can get this done. And so we were able to push a version of that through the House. The Senate had a much weaker version. Unfortunately, we did a lot of advocacy to try to make it the strongest version possible that would go into the final legislation. It wasn't exactly what constituents wanted, but still, it would be an unprecedented check on DOC's power, right? About just putting some limitations on what DOC can build in order to create this time to allow communities to develop and implement solutions, and for us to really, really meaningfully focus on decarceration. And so that went through conference, a final version came out. And then that's when things got a little bit hairy. So actually a conference report came out on July 21st, which would have been inside of the 10-day deadline that they would have sent it up to Baker, right? So he could have signed it or not, and they would have had an opportunity to override it in the marathon that was the end of the session. But somehow, despite the fact that the conference report of our language came out on July 21st, it didn't get sent to the governor until July 26th. And so that ceded all the power to Governor Baker to do whatever he wanted with the bill. He vetoed it. And now our policy is hanging in limbo, and
because it's the end of the session,
it's the
right?
end of the session.
So if they had done it earlier,
yes,
then there would have been time during the session to deal with his veto. But the fact that they waited till the very last second means that now, there's the session's over.
That's absolutely right. So the legislature could choose to wash its hand and say, hey, we did our best, and not choose to deal with it, or they could come back and they could do their job and listen to the will of the constituents that built this statewide movement for a widely popular bill and override Governor Baker's veto. And so that's what people are calling for. They're calling for a special session, calling for the legislature to come back and sort of handle this people's agenda, right? A number of bills that didn't get done that were widely popular, that affect people's day-to-day lives or affect our future as a Commonwealth, and in particular, communities most affected by the carceral system, by jails and prisons. That's what's up with the moratorium. I will say that I feel like people's energy has been so beautiful, and people feel angry and frustrated and confused by what happened at the end of the legislative session. They saw that the bill got done in the Senate. They saw that it got done in the House, and then don't understand why a Democratic supermajority would give all of this power to Baker to just kill a bill that was so clearly had this really powerful momentum behind it. So now, a year later, a year ago, we walked 90 miles across the state and talked to communities of sort of every political stripe and many demographics, and kind of people across the spectrum were spending $50 million on a women's prison for less than 200 women, for 140 state sentenced women, something's not adding up. This is the right moment to talk about what else is possible. And so we had that 90-mile march. We had countless rallies and demonstrations, not only at the State House, but in key legislative districts, where we went to where key decision makers in their home districts with their constituents standing side by side, formerly incarcerated women, directly affected women, shoulder to shoulder, saying no new women's prison, pass the moratorium. And really every single weekend since November 2021, we have had canvases and phone banks and knocking thousands of doors, making thousands of phone calls. And really what's exciting to us about that is not just the legislative advocacy, right? It's about having conversations with regular folks about what we want and need in Massachusetts and a different vision. We're so often given a menu, and if the menu says old prison or new prison. Clearly you're going to order a new prison off that menu, but we reject that. That's actually not what the real choice is, right? The real menu is community-led solutions. The real menu is legal pathways that already exist to decarceration, to bringing elder women home, sick women home, grandmothers, aunties, mothers, bringing sisters home, right? On the menu is what we're offering, like what directly affected women are leading projects and alternatives in their own communities, like asking for more investment rather than doubling down on incarceration. So we know so much else is possible. Like that's the menu that we're creating, that we're ordering from. And like, we reject this idea that the only choice is old prison, new prison. And so having those conversations with thousands and thousands of people at the grocery store, on their doorstep, on the phone, via text, like that's what's been really exciting about the organizing for this, and like shifting the idea of what's possible and bringing people closer to this vision that women who have lived through the experience of our incarceration have created and then are sharing. And really that offers more safety and well-being for all of us, right? And people are like, oh yeah, that resonates with me. I want that in my community. I want everyone to have that. We're down for that. So that's what's been awesome about the moratorium organizing.
It has been absolutely incredible. I really heard a lot about it. I knew about the, those events a year ago, and all the canvassing, all the phone calls. I mean, it is such a movement.
And just to remind people that you can listen to a great podcast we had about it. So also we did a whole conversation about the importance of it. And so can you talk a little bit about the no cost calls and the sort of fight around that? And then we can lead that into sort of the things that happened at the end of the session.
Yeah, totally. So this is the second session that we've been supporting no cost calls. And I should say the second session that families have been like waiting, right? And that includes our incarcerated community who has been following this really, really closely. So I think I'll just start by saying that like people are on an emotional roller coaster about what's happening with this legislation and like adding up the dollars that like if this was implemented, that could have made a major difference in their families' lives, right? Because it's money that people are spending on keeping their family connected, that they need for groceries, that they need for bills, that they need for gas.
Can we just break it down a little bit?
I just want to say, like, let's go
Totally.
backwards and just let people know. So some of us, who call loved ones
Yes.
in our prison system, people think it's like oh, like what's it, like 25 cents, $2? It's a lot of money. You're talking, I think, what is it? It's about it's a few dollars per minute. I mean, it's a lot of money putting in going out of because the people we police are poor people, so predominantly people who already are trying to make ends meet, and you're making them spend exorbitant funds to talk to loved ones. This is on top of the fact that we purposefully under-calorie our prisons.
Yep.
So they are then forced to go through the private system to spend money on other food to make up the fact that the food that the state provides is not enough to live on. And that is also 500%, 800% more than you and I would spend if we were at a grocery store on those
Absolutely.
goods. And
And
so
it just
all
went
of
up,
those
actually,
things
even more.
just went up. Oh,
Yep.
Jesus. So these are all ways to really, that are just taking money out of poor communities of color, communities who are over policed already, and putting it into, people who often don't live here, large corporations who run our prison systems. It's super inhumane. But even if you didn't care about the humanity of the people involved, it's also really bad policy. People who have connections to the outside, who are able to continue to have family because they will return to communities. They are more likely, if they are in constant communication with family, brought back into community, brought back into the fold, they're more likely to find to be able to transition back out than people who are disconnected. So it's also just really bad policy on top of inhumane and just absolutely cruel.
If I can quickly tag in before then going back to Mallory, what you were saying reminds me of how, like, in recent years, there's been increasing, let's say, like, discourse nationally about, let's say, like, the problem being private prisons, when, like, the problem is really all of them, not just about the private administration, especially because of, like, the fundamental problems in the design of that system itself, but also the way in which privatization and profiteering exists in public prisons all like everywhere, which is what you're saying. When it comes to, let's say, the markups on food, the markups on phone calls, somebody is profiting off of that. So even if it's just kind of, let's say, the Department of Corrections or like the local county is the administrator of it, it is still and ends up being used as a money-making facility off of those who often have the least.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant overview, definitely. And that the primary company here is Securus, that is exploiting and profiting off families. And then the Department of Correction, DOC, as well as each individual sheriff negotiates those contracts with the private company that runs the communication services, and they get kickbacks also. And I want to be clear, that's not personal in their personal bank account kickback, it's padding for their county or the state's budget on top of like hundreds of millions of dollars that have continued to swell, right? That incarcerated populations in Massachusetts have decreased, but spending on incarceration has continued to increase. And these kickbacks are on top of all of the public money they already get from all of our families, right? And so community members already have tons of questions about, where is this money going? There's no accountability or transparency in spending. And we know that it's not actually invested in the well-being of incarcerated people's lives, right? It's on staff spending. And so there's already tons of money in incarceration. The exorbitant fees, which is not just a price per minute, right? But also when you put money on people's books and canteens, there's service charges like that just adds up to hundreds of dollars. So one of the leading organizers on this was sharing what her family was paying, and it was over $400 a month on just phone calls. And again, so Jordan, thank you for bringing that up, that families out here are not just paying for that, right? They're also trying to pay for their loved ones to have edible food and hygiene supplies, because that does not exist in the state prisons or in the county jails. For people, and then to the tune of $14 million a year that families are spending. So it's really bills are piling up while the policy hasn't been passed. So the goal of the legislation was to make communication with incarcerated loved ones free, and so that bill ended up. It was independent, it was filed as legislation. And then it ended up, the vehicle for passing no-cost calls became the budget. And so the House submitted a version of the no-cost calls legislation. The Senate submitted a version. There again was this conference process. And then it went to Governor Baker. And I think this was confusing for people too, just logistically what happened. So the budget was passed, right? But then the no-cost calls was chopped off and it treated again as a separate bill because Charlie Baker sent it back with amendments and changes, which acts the same as vetoing it. So now it was separated from the budget and it has to be dealt with in its own way. So when the Governor Baker amended the no-cost calls policy, which I guess I should also say was still a work in progress. It was still imperfect legislation. So incarcerated people in particular and community members were saying, we wanted this to be stronger. We wanted there to be more protections. A key protection that people are continuing to advocate for is a guaranteed minimum number of minutes that people are provided a day. Because part of the concern is that if communication becomes free, that sheriffs or the Department of Corrections will then cut off access to the phone and only provide a limited number of calls or minutes on the phone a day. And so that's really scary, right? Because we wouldn't want to pass a policy that actually makes conditions inside worse. And so that is just a huge learning for all of us, and a huge thing that we deal with when we do inside outside organizing is making sure that what is implementation actually going to look like materially, how is this going to impact people's lives? And how do we not just do something in name only, but really offer rigorous protections and expanding access to communication and not restricting it. So it's still a work in progress. It's not a perfect policy. And I think people's vision is let's get this passed with no amendments, which I'll talk about in a second. So no expansion of pretrial detention. Let's get this passed. But also let's continue to work when they come back into session to like make this policy as strong as possible so that people actually have increased access to talk to their loved ones. When Governor Baker amended it, he made some other changes also that weakened what was already sent to him. And he made some additions, and he also very publicly said he was going to do this. So like basically I feel like the reading of like the interpretation is, y'all thought you were going to do something good for incarcerated people and their loved ones. And like, the audacity that you had to stand up for the most marginalized people in Massachusetts, incarcerated people and their loved ones, because you had that audacity, like, I'm punishing you with policy that I'm attaching to this. Like, I just feel like there's no other reading of it than like an FU to communities that are most impacted by the criminal legal system, right? And families. So he used it as a vehicle to advance his agenda to increase punishment before people are convicted of crimes. So he wanted to make new crimes. He wanted to expand when it's possible to hold people in pretrial detention without bail. And it's important to say that his version of that is indefinite. He wanted to take out all of the time limits and the checks that currently exist where people can come back into court and review their status when they're held on what's called a 58A. It's commonly referred to as a dangerousness hold, but a lot of people in the community are also pushing against that. Even calling it the dangerousness statute is totally racialized in who we perceive as scary and violent and dangerous to the community, right? So the number of the statute is 58A, it's a 58A hold. And so he wanted to like greatly increase the number of transgressions that people could be charged with. And then the prosecutor requests a 58A hearing, and then the judge decides whether that person should be held in pretrial detention. Also, I guess I should have talked more coherently, but now I'm getting into like what was attached to no cost calls. And I can talk about the details of how the 58A statute works, but really I wanted to talk about this idea of like, people have been saying like, these are separate issues and they should be addressed separately, right? It is common sense, compassionate policy in like the most popular policy that this Commonwealth has seen in years. Like, it is so broad.
The no cost calls.
No cost calls.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. And that if we want to have a conversation about pretrial detention, that conversation can happen, but it should happen separately. It shouldn't be tied to this policy that people's like day-to-day lives are depending on. And that's totally true. But I also feel like we shouldn't miss the reality of the reason why they're tied together is because Baker is representing a part of our society that wants to punish people brutally for having any contact with the criminal legal system whatsoever, even before they're convicted of a transgression, right? And that's the connection. The connection is racism. The connection is punishment. The connection is just really using the criminal legal system to continue to control and repress communities. So I feel like that we should say that they shouldn't be connected in a policy way, but we should have an understanding about why he did this. Like, he did this as a check on the growing movement and the growing power of people who are saying that, number one, incarcerated people are our loved ones and valued members of our community. And number two, the carceral system isn't actually about safety and well-being. It's about punishment and control. And it's also draining the resources that we need to actually create safety and well-being. So this is sort of like a shove back against that change that I feel like is happening in Massachusetts.
Reminds me a little bit of the conversation we had quite a while ago about how 20 years ago, the voting rights of incarcerated people were taken away as retribution, as a punishment for organizing inside of prisons to ensure that people who were allowed to vote would actually in fact vote. And that, so this is like repetition of similar sorts of policies of, punishing people for trying to, get their rights, trying to see that their rights are, that they have the rights that they should have, that the people of Massachusetts believe that they should have.
Absolutely.
I think it's also important to note that the two things that I think are drive me the most crazy about it is, one, what you're talking about is keeping people in prison and jail who have not been convicted of anything. Like,
That
first
is
off,
unbelievable.
we have indefinitely for
crazy.
any amount of time.
Yes.
And so our system is already broken. We already put in a ton of people I like to say our system does something. The only thing it does really well is lock up people who need help with addiction and homelessness and mental health. It does that well. It doesn't do anything else well. And it certainly doesn't find so-called criminals who are dangerous, right? Like, you can walk down my block and find them. There's nothing that's going to happen that the system is going to do that does well with that.
They could, as we said last week,
but-
they could just look for those people who are stealing your wages.
Yes,
We know
right.
exactly who those people are.
Well, I was thinking also when they say dangerousness, they never think about a developer who's kicking people on the street and evicting them illegally. That's never dangerous, right? But whatever this vague thing is, we know what they mean. They mean black people who look scary or brown people who look scary. And so I think that's the important thing first is like, this is all, let's like disentangle that piece. And then the other piece is that the police already don't enforce the things that they have. There are already things that they could do to protect victims that they basically shy away from. They're just like, oh, whatever, they have loose affiliation to. So the system we have in place and the laws that we have in place are already failing our communities. And they're just like, let's do more of those things. Let's do more of the things that already don't work and already they aren't enforcing in any sort of real way. And so I just think, and that's why we saw the Jane Fund and all the people who advocate for the very people that they are trotting out to try to push for more incarceration. We're like, actually, no, don't do this. This is not good for our communities. This is not what we want. And this is actually bad, right? The same people they're trying to pull out. And I think it's important to note that not only is it a failed system, not only is it totally immoral to indefinitely lock up people who have not been convicted of anything, it's also the very people they're trotting out to say, this is who it'll help. They're like, actually, don't do that.
It's also kind of reminds me of the kind of the point as well that I think we were talking about before the show about how you do have that the clear assumed binary between, let's say, a victim of a crime and a perpetrator of a crime isn't clear. And that's something I think that like when like Jane Doe was talking about, like noted that like if you have a case where you have a relationships with a large power imbalance and really low threshold for pretrial detention, you have the ability for the abuser in that relationship to get the person that they're abusing locked up. And that's something you're creating a system that's actually making it worse for people, kind of for victims of kind of domestic or sexual abuse, because you're just making it very easy, as well as to just kind of underscore Jordan's point. What's striking to me when listening to so many legislators talk about this is that it's pretrial detention for people who have not yet been convicted. A percentage of those people will not ever be convicted of that crime, and you are incarcerating them and taking away rights and doing many things that are equivalent to torture for something that they end up not actually being charged for.
Or that they're coerced into being convicted.
Yeah.
Because when you're stripped of your humanity and connection to community, what you do is very different than if you were free to fight your case.
Yeah, and just quickly, it's a great point as well. Like I'm thinking again, like for the Jane Doe's kind of opposition is you do often have like a number of, let's say, the women and girls who end up incarcerated are doing like so much of that, like a lot of that does end up stemming out of abusive relationships to begin with, and even the kind of crimes committed end up being kind of can be coerced, and it like there's a failure in a desire to view things in tight boxes of all of the different dynamics and power structures going on and creating something that happened.
And Mallory, you were talking about something right before we started recording that I just thought was so important, and I we're going long a little bit today, but I want to make sure that we talk about this part of it. You were talking about the way that Baker and the media portrayed, the way that they framed this entire issue, that it was somehow about protecting victims, and that it basically claims that there's only one type of victim, and that all the harm done to women and girls and other incarcerated people of all stripes, pre-trial people who are in jail and have literally never been convicted of anything, and maybe were never guilty, that harm doesn't exist. And can you talk a little bit about this sort of binary way of framing things that sort of came out of Baker's veto and the way that the press sort of repeated that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there's a few that are actually at work and intersecting. And the first one is that the idea that there are some people who cause harm and some people who experience harm, and they're totally different people and they're on two different sides. And that's not real. Like, first of all, abolition invites us into the idea that all of us have caused harm or have that capacity to cause harm, and we've experienced harm, and that varies widely by degree, right? But it also, the reality of community is that there's not some people over here and some people over here. Like, we are whole communities of complex people that have experiences. And so the idea that there's only victims and only offenders is not how real life works. It's not how real community works. And the other thing is that there are quote unquote good victims who we listen to, and quote unquote bad victims who we don't, who are, and that's all about like racism that's imposed on people. And that's all about other experiences that they've had. Like, if you've been incarcerated before, your experience as a sexual assault survivor just doesn't count, right? Or if that harm happens to you while you're incarcerated, it's totally silenced and not recognized as violence against you at all. And so we were trying to lift up this idea that we shouldn't only be listening to victims when it's convenient. We shouldn't be coming to victims and only asking or only offering more punishment. So what Families for Justice as Healing, with the directly affected women who lead us, were saying is, we're tired of only being offered jail. When we want to talk about how do we address harm, when we want to talk about how can women exit unhealthy relationships, when we want to talk about what are the resources that people need to heal from generational trauma, we are tired of only being offered more punishment, because it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked in decades. It has only caused more harm, and it's not going to work. And so the other part about this conversation about the need to somehow expand the ability of the state to hold people in pretrial detention, that has been increasing. Like, the use of 58A, the exact statute that they want to expand, has already expanded exponentially. The state has incredible power to hold people for a very long time before they're convicted. And we shouldn't be expanding that any further. In fact, what we need to be doing is exploring what directly affected people have actually been saying really works and what people really need. And so those are the solutions, the community-led solutions that we call reimagining communities, right? That if people have access to safe, stable, dignified housing, that gives them the freedom to be safe and well in their own space, right? And if we have other ways of responding to conflict and harm, like community-led responses that don't entangle people in the criminal legal system, that often also gives people opportunities to heal and resolve issues that don't rely on the jail and prison system, which is just a site of more violence. So, like, one of the things that we were saying in these, and I guess for context, like, this podcast does such a great job of like talking about like literally what's going on. We're talking about organizers sending like very late night emails through the weekend, through July 30th and 31st, trying to figure out what's going on. We are demonstrating outside. We went inside. At one point, like, the halls were like echoing with our voices, and a stream of senators came by and walked by community members who were saying like, no new felonies, and no expansion of pretrial detention, and pass no cost calls, and pass the moratorium. Like, they had to walk by people and just like, most of them didn't even look or turn, or like, they just kept walking. And so people are trying to figure out even what's going on. And in one late night email that we sent to be like, please don't do this, like, vote down the governors, vote down Senator Tarr's amendments, right? Because that's a whole other conversation. Like, there were the governors, and then there was this attempt to try to make exactly his policies just more palatable, right? Like a little milder. And so we said that one of the charges that was on the list was assault and battery on a family member, which, if you read it on paper, like, that sounds terrible, like hurting a family member, right? But what that really means is, like, somebody calls the cops because they hear a noise, because conflict is criminalized, because there's no other number to call, because communities have been stripped of all of the resources that they need to have other interventions. So 911 gets called. When the cops come, they have to arrest somebody. And exactly what Jordan said, very often that person is the woman, is the mother. And so one of the most common charges against women in the Commonwealth is assault and battery on the family member. Is that because there's been some wild increase and women are so violent? And no, absolutely not. It's because we have one system, a brutal system of punishment that comes and strips people away from their home and only offers incarceration as a response when harm happens. So that's like just an example of the way that we were saying this is going to like pull way too many people, and it's widening the net for who we can hold in pretrial detention. It could take women and moms away from their families. So on the other side of that, outside of the policy piece, the real heart of our work is what we call reimagining community. So formerly incarcerated women on the ground, leading the interventions that actually would heal from these instances of harm in the community without the system at all. Like I said, like a guaranteed income program. So women just have the resources that they need to provide for their family in safe and healthy ways, so they don't have to make choices that put them in harm's way or put them in the talons of the criminal legal system. A guaranteed housing pilot where we help people pay rent so they have safe, stable, dignified housing. And community crisis response, where people have another number to call with community members that they recognize and trust, who are trained to come in and help people handle difficult situations, right? Help people handle harm in a different way. So that's going on all the time, even while the State House is doing whatever the State House is doing. Like, that's the real work happening on the ground.
I just want to put into real life what Mallory is talking about. So, we, my family, we have taken in foster kids, and one of the foster kids that we got because the police showed up, arrested people for things that ended up not being things that they did. There were kids there. The cops, a mom came to get her kid back when they got called that the police were there, picked up her kid. The police decided that kid was in a dangerous situation, even though no one's alleging that there's dangers. And in the end, all charges are dropped. Nothing is even happening. The police rip the baby from the mom who's holding this kid at this point, because came to pick up the kid from this place, picked up the kid. The cops rip the kid away from the mom, charge the mom with assault and battery for having the kid be ripped away by this police person. DCF takes the kid. That mom doesn't see the kid. That kid's in our care as foster parents for 6 months for something that ends up not being a crime. The charges get dropped on the mom, but the mom, under Baker's rules, could have been held in jail indefinitely for that, because she didn't have money. She couldn't have paid to get out. She couldn't have found another way, right? There's no cash bail. Right? She's a violent person. Look, the police are saying that she did this terrible thing, that they end up, because all the people there were like, the police were out of control. The police were yelling at this person. The police were ratcheting up while everyone was calm and made this child cry. And then, the police caused the problem, caused the thing. The child is ripped away for 6 months, and you're going to lock up the parent. And that is not an abnormal situation. Assault and battery is the bar. That's like the lowest thing that they will charge you for looking at them the wrong way on these things, for fleeing, for all of these crimes that they know are not real, but they just do to try to load you up so that you plea out, so that you get caught in the system. So you got to go to court, lose your pay, lose your job, get caught in this system. This is I just want to make clear for listeners that this isn't some abstract, or this is just some side thing that sort of happens, or just a few people. This is a real way to disrupt the lives of Black and brown and poor people. Not a small thing, like a day-to-day lived things. And one of the things that always sticks with me is one of the other parents who was there because we would show up at court in support of the mom whose kid that we were fostering, would say is like, oh, well, poor children's kids are just the state's until they decide to let us parent them. And that has always stuck with me. And that is what we're talking about. There was thousands of people just flooding through, trying to see their kids, trying to get back to work, trying to balance work and this court process, this carceral process. And what we're saying is that this doesn't work, and we know it doesn't work, and we don't need to go down this path. And so to tie something that we know will make actually bringing people back into community better to increasing this unconscionable system of punishment, of harm, of disruption, of money out of their pockets into people who don't need it, into systems that don't need it. That's a real thing that we're talking about, and it can't be underscored enough. The harm that was being minimized by the media, and that was being used as a political tool by Democratic senators who should shamefully know better. And every single one of them who voted for this should know that that what they've done is racist and it's shameful. And I hope they remember it in Black History Month that's coming up. I hope they remember it when they're quoting Dr. King and all these crap, when they're trying to figure out what to do with the letters to Birmingham. I see all of them on social media doing these things. I want them to remember that the real world impact to what they've done is to harm the same people, to be a part of the system of racism, of carceration, of all of these systems that they themselves will plod themselves on the back for not being a part, for being the good people. Not being a part.
And you said it earlier, just more, it's doubling and tripling down on failed policy in the face of people rising up and saying, we don't want this anymore. In every way, we don't want it. We want a 5-year pause on jail and prison construction. We want to be able to talk to our loved ones. Like, we want a different way forward in Massachusetts than more of what we know only causes further harm. And so that definitely felt like a slap in the face. And then at 1:30 in the morning, you're like, there's not even a public ability to bear witness to the fact that this is what is being done with the policy that everyday people have fought for, led by people who have been through the system themselves, that say there has to be something better than this. We demand something better. And so I just, and Senator Barrett said, I promise you we will live to regret this. And so, like, I think Jordan, you had also mentioned earlier, the same sort of the racist caricatures, like the invention of an archetype that we need to be afraid of in order to justify this type of policy, like that had the echo of the 90s, right? And the incredibly racist super predator of the 80s, right? All of it, when all of these, in every decade, we've had this like choice of which way that we're going to go. Are we going to continue to expand the system that is causing generations of harm? And so I think Senator Barrett tried to be like, let's not do this, especially right now. Let's not do this in the middle of the night. Let's not do this when this policy hasn't had a hearing. Let's not do this when this policy was already rejected, when it had the opportunity to go through the process and we already said no. And unfortunately, the vote to allow Senator Tarr's amendment, which was an expansion of pretrial detention, that was an expansion of criminalization, choosing to vote yes on that in a majority, also what, regardless of whatever other reason or what else they thought was going to happen that day, they knew that taking that vote was also going to kill no cost calls in that moment. And so there is something to be done, right? That we don't have to accept this. And so there is an organizer who I know who was writing to senators personally and saying, like, this is why I'm so hurt and disappointed by this vote. This is the impact that I see. And also what repair looks like is coming back into session to address this and not just letting it go and saying, like, I don't know if I voted right, like at 1:30 in the morning. No, like, we can come back and do something about this. We don't have to accept business as usual. We can put policy, we can put people before procedure, right? Archaic, outdated procedure. Like, we can go back to work. We can pass no cost calls to alleviate this unfair burden on people. And we can do it without expanding pretrial detention and criminalization. We can get that done. And an even more straightforward path is coming back to override, Governor Baker's veto of the moratorium bill. Like, that's a straightforward, come back into session. It can get done in a day. Like, let's do this. We already have agreement in both chambers that this is policy that is worth passing. So let's get it done.
And I think that's such an important point because of the fact that there's no reason why that we should just assume that it is how it is, that they then are doing no actual work. Legislative, like on policy making between now and January, when when like the new legislature comes in, that even though the last day of the kind of formal session is July 31st, or as kind of you indicated, technically August 1st, when they're still voting like at like 1:30 a.m. the next day. And even as I know, like Senator Cindy Cream, who was the lead sponsor for No Cost Calls, said during that debate, like she's like, have any of my colleagues even read the list of charges being added to pretrial detentions? Like, we are voting very early in this morning with a lot of stuff on the table. Like, have people actually given enough attention to something that actually has very serious implications? But along that, like, people probably aren't going to come back in August. August is almost over, but in 2020, during the pandemic, because of they're not having finished stuff, they came back and they did work in September and did work in like September and October, and they did work kind of throughout the fall, and they did work that year up until the very beginning of January, on the last kind of actual day before the new session starts. And there's no reason for them to leave a bunch of unfinished business and just say, sorry, our clock ran out, when it's a clock that they choose to set.
Yeah. Well, I am going to, I'm going to put in just a little piece of optimistic note here before we end, which is that one thing that, we discussed a little bit beforehand, and I think we're all so incredibly impressed by, is how much this campaign has in some ways changed what people expect in terms of timeline. Because this campaign has been, a year and a half, a couple of years of like intense organizing and really incredibly well done organizing. And that a lot of the folks who were organized, right, constituents on the ground who have been activated around this campaign are asking themselves, hey, and asking each other and asking, out loud in the press, why is this not passing? We worked hard. There's no excuse, there's no reason. And we've talked many times on here about how policies take 20 years to pass, it's crazy how long it takes to pass things. And so what an incredible job you all have done around this issue to really help us realize that it should not take 20 years to pass good policy that is really win-win for everyone. And I would love for you, Mallory, just to talk a little bit about what can people do now? How can they stay in touch on this campaign and really be part of this movement?
Awesome. Yeah. So thank you so much. We're also really proud of the people power that got built. And that's what we're really doing, right? That even beyond any individual policy, again, we're changing the conversation in Massachusetts. We're shifting the ground. We're making it more possible to end the incarceration of women and girls, and then all people, and really thinking about what community-led solutions are going to create real safety and well-being through our Reimagining Communities work. So it's ongoing, and we have heard from our folks that we're not ready to give up, right? We know that, again, it's possible to actually rectify the situation. There's precedent for doing it. We can and should do it. It's doable. Come back to work, call a special session. And so if you want to get involved, we are continuing to lead actions, do a phone bank. And then the very first thing that you could do is call your own senator and call your own state rep and say, it's still important to me that you come back and override the Governor Baker's veto of the jail and prison construction moratorium. And I can share the link if you go to bit.ly/mass, MASS, moratorium guide. I'll make sure you all get that. You can have all the information that you need about the phone number and script. And in fact, if you just go to nonewwomensprison.org, you can also see all of the volunteer opportunities and continue to organize with us. And there's also no cost, I think it's no cost calls ma.org as well, so that you can also help demand that the legislature comes back and gets no cost calls done this session as well, because the bills are piling up for families. And it just wasn't good enough. It just wasn't good enough. What got done wasn't good enough. There's an opportunity here to do better. And we really hope that the legislature takes it. And either way, we are going to continue to organize towards this vision of a better Massachusetts for all of us and build a bridge into the 2023 session, right? Where we're going to continue demanding the same things: decarceration, investment in communities, releasing women. So yeah, we're going to keep going, and we hope people are with us. And I have to say that I'm super grateful for Progressive Mass, who has just helped people understand what's happening. So if you go to our action guide right now, there's a link to Progressive Mass's write-up about the end of the session that just helped people make sense of it. And then you all recently published what else was left on the table. So we focused a lot on no cost calls and the moratorium bill, but there's other things on the table that people, desperately want and need, like millions of dollars so that people can participate in their government virtually. And we should not be giving up on that. Like our disabled community members, all community members who aren't able to physically get into the space where their government works should continue to have a voice. And so what would it look like to have a sort of a people's agenda this fall and people sort of standing shoulder to shoulder and recognizing that our issues are related, and like broadening the idea of like what progressive politics looks like in Massachusetts, with some abolitionist stuff there at the center, right? And just people coming together and saying, we can do better, let's get it done. And so I think people are really excited about that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mallory. It's wonderful to have you. You're doing such incredible work. And thanks everyone for listening, and we will see you all next week.
Thank you so much.